Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine the academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Pranay Kotasthane, who is the Deputy Director of the Takshashila Institution and chairs their high-tech geopolitics program. Pranay co-writes Anticipating the Unintended, a newsletter on public policy ideas and frameworks, and co-hosts Pulyabazi, a popular Hindi-Urdu podcast on politics, policy, and technology. He is the co-author of the books Missing in Action, Why Should You Care About Public Policy, and the latest graphic non-fiction narrative, We the Citizens. He has also co-edited India's Marathon, Reshaping the Post-Pandemic World Order. Today we're discussing his most recent book, When the Chips Are Down, co-authored with Abhiram Manchi. We spoke about the evolution of the semiconductor industry, industrial targeting, Moore's law and Rock's law, Taiwan's comparative advantage in chips, whether India can ever lead in the semiconductor sector, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcast. Hi Pranay, welcome to the show.
Hi Shruti, glad to be back here.
I'm so thrilled to have you, and this is because you have a new book out. This one is When the Chips Are Down with your co-author Abhiram Manchi. And you have another book out because, you write books faster than I can read them. This is a graphic novel called We the Citizens, which is all things related to our republic, our rights, our constitution, and more generally how we must live together, right? And now that you have 3 books out, and I like them all, I have decided that I should start publicizing to the world that you're actually my student.
Yeah.
One of my very first. So now, as you know, success has lots of parents and teachers. Now that you are a 3 times published author, well done, one of my earliest students.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Actually, you taught a course on constitutional history, and that was one of my first introductions ever into this subject. And I still remember some of the concepts and ideas. So thanks.
I think you are the master now, and you have written more about the topic than I have, but I'm so thrilled. Today, I want to talk with you about, primarily about When the Chips Are Down. Before you took my class, which is, of course, the event that led to all your future successes, I can't even say that with a straight face. In your past life, you were actually one of the engineers working on semiconductor design, starting with Texas Instruments and other places. Can you walk me through, very briefly that journey and that part of your life before we jump into the sort of geopolitics and geoeconomics and technological aspects of the book?
Sure, yeah. So I did engineering from NIT Surathkal, one of the top 10 colleges back then in India. And once I did that, and I did do my electronics engineering there, and I always had an interest there. I was always fascinated with semiconductors and the fact that you have all these brilliant and really wonderful magical things like computers, etc., and the hardware behind that software always fascinated me. So I always wanted to learn that better, so went to electronics by choice. And then after doing the engineering, I got a job opportunity to work at Texas Instruments. Again, it was my dream company back then to work at that place, because Texas Instruments was one place where all these things really started, so even the Nobel Prize for the integrated circuit was shared by Jack Kilby, who was an engineer at Texas Instruments. So that was fascinating. And that's when I started a career as a design engineer. So my title was IC design engineer. And back then in India, like in Bangalore, even though we know it as a hub of software, it is also a hub for chip design, right? So now the government estimates that 20% of the world's design engineers are in Bangalore, but roughly 300,000. Back then also there were a lot of things happening, and these are largely MNCs which have set up their R&D centers in Bangalore and so on and so forth. And Texas Instruments was the first MNC to set up shop in Bangalore. So technically, Bangalore is a Silicon Valley, right? In the sense, first company was a company which does make silicon. So that's how I started in 2007. Was largely doing one small part of the chip design process. So any one processor, we used to make mobile processors. My team used to make mobile processors for phones. Phones weren't the most, and I mean, not the iPhone types, but new smartphones which were coming up back in 2008-9. And back then we were making the processors, and one processor team might have thousands of engineers working on it, right? Some work, it's a very modular process, so some work on a small, let's say, an imaging aspect of it, or some are working just on the USB side of it, etc. And all of that gets integrated into someone who's working on the entire chip level stuff. And then there are some other teams working on, how does it integrate with the phone and the final OEM, etc. So all those are layers. I was working on one small component of this, which was the graphics processor, one small part of the graphics processor. And after that, after a few years, I was working on the entire chip level, the processor level team. And one of the good experiences I had is in India, for example, we know that a lot of design happens there, but you don't get to actually see the hardware because we don't have any commercial manufacturing facilities. But the good thing at Texas Instruments was we did have a low-cost tester. So we wouldn't manufacture the dies, the chips, but they used to come back in the office and you could actually get to see the physical stuff and do some testing, etc. on a big room-sized machine. So that was some of the good aspects of it, and it was great fun. So I did that work for around 7 years before your class changed my journey.
I wish I could take credit for that. But everything you described about what you did, which is this, extreme level of specialization, how the design aspect, the manufacturing aspect, the assembly aspect, all of these parts got separated by the time you entered that business that had already taken place, and why India has really been more on the design side and not been in the manufacturing and even the assembly, which now we're hoping to enter. And you explain these things beautifully in your book. But before I get to India, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the historical progression of the semiconductor technology and sort of like that global industry. In your book, you describe it in three specific ways. You talk about the geopolitical progression, the geo-economic progression, and the technological progression, right? These aspects are separated. When I was reading the book, to me, it felt like at the core of these three are Moore's law, and that's basically the observation that the number of transistors on a microchip doubles every 2 years. It was actually a prediction which turned out to be so accurate that it became a law. The second is Rock's law, which was again a prediction that the cost of a semiconductor chip fabrication plant actually doubles every 4 years, which again has turned out to be so true that it's a law. And the third is, of course, the standard old established laws of absolute and comparative advantage. So to me, it seems like these three are the governing laws of sort of the history of the semiconductor industry. Can you parse this out for us, like, bit by bit?
Yeah. Let's begin with the Moore's law and that idea, right? So semiconductors, as we know it, before semiconductors and chips, we still had electronics in a sense through something called the vacuum tubes, right? But these were really huge machines used to take substantial part of the electricity of a small town back then, right? To do the kinds of things you can now do at very low voltages and current. So that was the technology back then. And then through the 1940s, 50s, there were a lot of things which happened in AT&T, Bell Labs, etc. And a lot of innovation, which was also a byproduct of the Cold War era, right? So the Cold War era led to this competition, the Sputnik moment, and a lot of investment going into new areas of technological progress, including on semiconductors. So AT&T is one place which becomes the hub where a lot of these things come together, and it is able to convert a lot of the promise of transistors into reality. Right? So when we talk about semiconductors, we're broadly just referring to the material used, and as the name suggests, the conductivity is somewhere between a full insulator and a conductor. Right? Conductor, the electrons, so many electrons will move at a short time that you cannot control, whereas in insulators the electrons won't move at all, so again no use. But in a semiconductor you can control it after modifying the properties of the particular semiconductor using something called doping. So once you can do that, you have this magical thing called the transistor, which is really a fundamental building block, right? Just like the cell is the building block of the human body, this is the building block of our digital lives, is how I say. So this, once you can control the flow of electrons in one part of the circuit using current that is flowing in another part of the circuit, you essentially have a switch, and it's really a superpower because you can do a multiple number of things, right? You can control current in one part of the circuit to control voltages, or to control temperatures, or to control a bunch of other things, right? So you can use these transistors to amplify current, to store value, to produce signals. Really wonderful thing. So that was the first step. But yet transistors, there were skeptics because transistors were made now, but the wires that are used to connect these transistors to kept growing in number, right? So as the complexity grew, the number of wires that would grow, even though transistors were small, the number of wires growing from one transistor to the other were huge. So then the next step of innovation came when people thought that why can't we put all these transistors with different functionalities into a same package? And that is what is essentially the integrated circuit. So I'm simplifying it, but that was essentially one way it started, that can we pack all these things together? So that was the next step jump in this journey. And once ICs came into being, the next process was something called the planar process. So until this, ICs were made, but they were made manually, transistor by transistors. You can imagine, like, you can do it for 30 transistors, 40 transistors, but today we have around 150 million transistors per millimeter square, right? So very difficult to do that in any meaningful way manually. So the idea was, it started there. Then the next step was planar process. What it did was, you don't need to do all these things step by step, but you do it in the form of layers. So what they used to do is, there's a wafer on which you carve out these transistors. So layer by layer, you build this sort of a city across many, many chips on one single wafer. So that was the next step jump. And once planar process came into being, that is when by 1965 this observation came by Gordon Moore, who was back then at Fairchild Semiconductors, and he said this observation he made only for the chips which were being made at Fairchild Semiconductors, that what you said, the number of transistors will roughly double every 18 months or so, right? And by the way, he also said back in 1965 that ICs will lead to wonders such as home computers and automobiles, automatic controls for automobiles, personal portable communications equipment, which we today call a mobile phone, right? And he's made this observation when there were just 64 transistors in ICs, right? But that sort of, and today's, as I said, if you must be having an iPhone, Apple i14 chip has 134 million transistors per millimeter square. So, I mean, I am just baffled continuously by how it was a prediction, and it was an observation which became a prediction, and that prediction became a law, because it became a vision which sort of people chased, and there was a lot of innovation, comparative advantages, etc. So just not just a technical revolution, but also an economic revolution which went in parallel, and it became a vision which the world chased together, and it has been kept alive through all these various decades.
So I want to now move from, the Moore's law, which is this doubling of transistors on a microchip every 18 months to 2 years, to what that leads to, which, is a cost problem, right? Which is what led us to Rock's law. So this is the idea that, yes, people who are going to use all these wonderful chips, right? Semiconductors in every aspect of their life. You listed out a whole number of uses. Even in 1965, people had a vision. But to actually get those many transistors and then keep doubling them, you needed production processes, fabrication processes that were really sophisticated, which needed very, very sophisticated and highly specific machines, which then, required a lot of capital investment and so on. So that changes the way the semiconductor industry operates fundamentally, right? Because in your book, you initially described that, it all starts with innovations at Bell Labs, it goes to Fairchilds, it goes to Texas Instruments. There are a few American players in the business, but these American players are doing everything start to finish. They're imagining the chip, their engineers are designing it, they have an in-house place where they actually fabricate, manufacture, assemble. I don't even know if assembly was a thing at that point, but everything is kind of in-house. But then that changes within a couple of decades. So what happened there?
Right, absolutely. So this is what you referred to was called the IDM, the Integrated Device Manufacturer model. And even today, some memory chips do follow that process. So for example, Samsung for its memories might do all of these things together by itself. But when we are talking about chips today, we largely also talk about logic chips. So your processors, etc., which are not memory chips, but they are complex logic doing a particular function. So once this idea began that you need to pack in more and more transistors, why do you want to pack in more transistors? Because you want to do more complex things. And once you had that idea, then you started thinking, okay, can I do the same thing at a higher speed, at a lower power, etc. So for that, you don't need to just increase the number of transistors. You also need to reduce the size of that transistor. Right? So now you started making things smaller and smaller. And once you try to do that, the costs of manufacturing increased significantly, right? So now instead of 64 transistors, if you have to pack 6,400 transistors, first you will need a software to do that, right? So you can't do that by hand. So some designer will have to come and just focus on doing this really, really well and do all the verification testing. Yeah, one of the many. So you will start doing that. Once you do that, you need the manufacturing processes which can really carve out fine features on this silicon to be able to achieve that functionality, right? And today's smallest feature size, like we use 5 nanometers, it's just a few atoms wide, right? So you can imagine the kind of complexity which is required. So the machine which is used today, for example, for the 5 nanometer chips, in the manufacturing, one of the machines used is for the lithography process is by a company called ASML in Netherlands, right? So it's the size of a bus. It takes 2 aircraft to transport it, costs $200 million a pop. So that kind of complexity, it kept building on, right? That's where we've reached today. So once these costs started rising, of a company, if it had to do, let's say it had to pack in more transistors and make them smaller, it had to invest in manufacturing facility, and that manufacturing cost was not just incremental, right? You need to have an entire new process, new way of designing smaller transistors, new way of manufacturing them, new machines to get this kind of functionality. So the cost kept rising, and that is what, as you referred to, is called the Rock's law. So by the 1980s, this became very cumbersome for a new startup to enter, right? So just imagine there's a startup in Silicon Valley wants to do this, but they are not going to make billions of dollars of investment to be able to do that. So that's when an economic sort of a revolution took place. So former engineer from Texas Instruments who moved to Taiwan, TSMC.
This is Morris Chang.
He and a few others got together and they said to all the companies that we will promise you two things. One, we will be your contract manufacturer. So you don't, whether you are AMD, whether you are NVIDIA wasn't there back then, but companies like NVIDIA, whoever are the companies which want to make chips, they told them, you don't need to worry about making your own chips. You make the design, give us those files, and we will be your contract manufacturers. The second promise they made is we will never compete with you. Like, we will not enter into design, we will own. So this is classic comparative advantage, right? So the Taiwan story started then. There were other factors also. This process is environmentally polluting back at then. So in the US, they were okay to let it go to another country, and Taiwan was ready to absorb that cost. That was another reason. And back then, even the value addition, which used to happen in the manufacturing segment, wasn't very high. So again, the US companies thought, I mean, why should I waste my effort, time, energy in doing something? So classic how the comparative advantage based specialization works. So Taiwan started doing this from very low end. Value addition wasn't much. The only way you could make money was make billions and billions of chips for many, many customers. And you won't make much per chip, but when you make billions of chips, you will make a profitable business. So that's how they started. And over 30, 40 years, they have built so much expertise and that in that recipe of making chips that actually today the value addition which happens in manufacturing is more than the value addition which happens in design, slightly more, but that's a very counterintuitive result, right? Generally, we think manufacturing not a big deal. It's the design where there's a lot of expertise, but that has slightly changed in the semiconductor space.
Yeah, and because here also, the further innovation I realize is that manufacturing and assembly also used to be integrated at one point and that got separated. Manufacturing became such a high value proposition on its own, requiring such specialized sort of environmental requirements. And when I say environmental, I don't mean like, sustainability wise. I mean, you needed an ability to take very large amounts of credit, right? You needed the appropriate capital environment to make that kind of investment. And of course, the ability to keep changing around your machinery, which will have, something as specific as the rules that govern accounting and how you depreciate assets in the semiconductor manufacturing industry is quite different from virtually any other industry. So there is such a specific things that past a point, Taiwan wasn't even the cheapest assembly market. They got so rich that the assembly started happening in other places. So what you've given us is sort of a great summary. Now, I want to just drag us back to the present moment for a minute. After the pandemic, a couple of things have happened. One is over the last decade, we've seen a sort of, first a lukewarm war and then an out and out sort of beginnings of a Cold War between US and China. And this has semiconductors at the core of it because, semiconductors are not just used in our fridges and our mobile phones and our cars, but they're also used in drones, right? In all your fighter jets, in missiles. Anything that needs to be targeted with laser precision actually requires semiconductors, which we now know is how the US won, the Gulf War and sort of started a new kind of arms race, which was a semiconductors race. This wasn't the old arms race, which was a nuclear race. So that's one part of it. But the second part of it were the pandemic related disruptions, right? This is the supply chain disruptions. If Wuhan shuts down because the city is shut down or is under lockdown because of COVID, you have a lot of things that are being assembled in Wuhan in terms of, various electronics, sort of the low end chips and so on. And now suddenly all of that comes to a standstill. We experienced like a brief glimpse of that when there was the huge earthquake followed by tsunami in Japan. But everyone was so focused on the nuclear reactor that, we didn't quite pay attention to this. But, the glimpse of this started almost, 2010, 2011. So can you separate this geopolitics aspect of it, which is US and China at the center of it, and the standard garden variety globalization leads to too much division of labor and supply chain sort of complexity, which now people are trying to figure out how to de-risk or roll back?
I mean, we just talked about Taiwan and US, but again, as you said, then China started picking up pace in assembly, and then Malaysia, Singapore does a bit of it. Of course, Korea, Japan, and Japan's story is also very interesting. So all those players started entering, and then India through the design space, Israel started doing things, and Europe was also doing well on design. So these were the main characters involved in the story. But what happened beyond that in recent times is the US-China rivalry, which is a structural rivalry, as we say in the geopolitics literature, that had to be fought on some domain, right? So now, can it be done as a hot war? Not possible. Nuclear weapons, etc. Can it be done in the economic realm, that also is very difficult because you know better than me. There's so much, if there are tariffs, etc. put, the losses to America will also be significant. So you can't do a full decoupling at economic level as well. You can do it for some things. So then the idea is, which is the domain where this contestation can happen? And technology has come up as one new realm where all nation states are thinking about this as one decisive advantage that they can gain over the other. So they are trying to build strength in that. And within the technology stack, if you look at China's technology stack, one of the weaknesses is the semiconductors domain. So they have done quite well in many of the other realms, but on the semiconductor side, they are still largely dependent on the US and other countries, you know, for specialized gases from Japan, for the machines, you still depend on ASML in Netherlands or Lam Research in US, etc. So there are a lot of dependence, and that's why I thought US sort of chose this as the area, even within the broad technology space. So that is one. The other reason, of course, is Taiwan, right? So because China-Taiwan relations are worsening, and even some of the most advanced chips that US must be using for its military, let's say F-35 or others, would be finally manufactured in Taiwan. So there was this other risk that what happens if China were to take over Taiwan for some other reason, not necessarily semiconductors, what happens then to these facilities, right? So that was another reason why, one, these kind of export controls started, and second, a huge round of industrial policy measures have started where all nation states are trying to localize a bigger part of this industry into their home borders, right? So that sort of unleashed a new thing. So this is the geopolitics side, but also in COVID-19, this became something that everyone faced, right? It was not just at the level
Not
of
just US and
nations.
China, yeah.
And everyone faced this shortages that were in the news. There were many cars shipped which didn't have some of the features because of the shortages. In fact, in India, there were lots of delays for car productions and many electronic productions as well. So this reached a lot of common person level as well. So that was the second reason. And the third is also because semiconductors underlie a lot of future advances in technology. That also became a factor. So for example, you are now seeing the news that OpenAI wants to build its own chips as well, and Nvidia's stocks have risen a lot, etc., because that
it's
will
overtaken Google now. It's the third most valuable company in the world, which is extraordinary to me.
Exactly. And so all these things came together at one point of time. That's why I thought of conceptualizing this as a metacritical technology, right? So there are three kinds of criticalities which come together at the same time, and that's why there is a whole lot of things happening in this space, including industrial policy and other things.
You've touched on so many things, but I want to start by parsing out this idea of the metacritical technology. So, you know, for instance, we were looking to buy a car because we had moved out of New York City and moved to the suburbs of the Washington, D.C. area. And, you know, that's not a very pedestrian-friendly place. And there were lots of delays. We eventually ended up buying a used car because, you know, the order delay on the new cars was so old. And when I started digging into it, I thought, okay, we're not buying a Tesla. Like, we don't literally have a computer running the car. What's going on? And I realized that even that little button that, you know, raises and lowers the window of a car has some very relatively sophisticated semiconductor chips and transistors that are making that tiny action work, right? Which to me is magical because I grew up in the first car that I learned to drive on, you know, didn't have power steering, didn't have power windows. You know, you literally had to roll and unroll the windows. So the first part I learned was the ubiquitous nature, right? It is in everything, not just our phones. It's, you know, a rice cooker has a chip which helps us time when to start it and when to stop it, as opposed to standing on top of the stove waiting for your, you know, rice or dal to boil. So that part, of course, makes it metacritical. But the second part is how much can we separate the everyday garden variety chips from the very high-end sophisticated chips, because that's what the Chips Act has tried to do. This is the continuation of the China policy from Trump to Biden. So, certain kinds of chips which are very, very sophisticated, either technologically or can be used in military terms, are excluded. So, first question is that feasible, right? And the second question is, doesn't that kind of go against the historical progression which you partly described in the book, which is that semiconductors became what they became because there were so many commercial, everyday uses? That's the reason you saw Moore's Law, right? That's the reason this industry took off and this technology sort of transformed the world in less than a century. So, one, can they be separated? And two, is that bad actually, as opposed to ideal when it comes to national interests?
Like you rightly said, initially when this industry started, so the biggest customer or the only customer was the Apollo program. So it absorbed most of the chips that were produced, and then it entered the missiles of the US armed forces, etc. But slowly, as we discussed, the cost kept rising, and the only way you can make that productive is when you're selling it to a large number of customers, and which are not your militaries. So then a lot of advancements thereafter started happening on the commercial side. So today, the most advanced chips in terms of power and in terms of the speed, your iPhone will have the far more advanced chip than it will be there in an army platform as well, or a naval platform in the US, because their considerations will be about reliability. You should be able to operate at different temperatures. They are not so concerned about the most fastest chip or the most advanced chips, but in the commercial space we are, right? And even OpenAI or NVIDIA chips are being used for commercial purpose, right? Not for military. So this is what in the military literature we call spin-ons. Earlier you had spin-offs, but now you have spin-ons, right? So commercial technologies lead your advancements, and then they get carried over into military, whereas it used to be exactly the opposite earlier. So that's why commercial things are important, and all the things that happened in the semiconductor industry earlier were very useful for this kind of progress, right? So you essentially could do comparative advantage based specialization, and the things just work so fine, right? So you mentioned the ubiquitousness of this. The reason why we didn't care about it was because the system just worked so perfectly well. So why do you need to know the gory details of what's there? Because it just works absolutely brilliantly, perfectly. But because of the three reasons that we discussed earlier, there has been this idea that now we need to think more about this resilience versus efficiency trade-off. The supply chain works efficiently very well. But if there were these three conditions that are to come together about the geoeconomic, geopolitical, and the technological imperatives, then there might be some problems, and hence we need to build some more resilience. That's the whole idea. Now, I have a lot of problems with that. Even I think, like, how will that happen?
Can it be done?
Now, I think, can it be done? It can be done, but it will come at a cost, is how I feel. So, I mean, all of us will have to pay the cost of higher prices. Maybe the speed of innovation will decline, etc. So those are the costs. But even if you see in the US-China side, the idea is not, I don't call it a war, US-China chip war, because it's not a war in my assessment. The decoupling between US and China on chips is not at all the levels. So to come to your question about at all, is there a difference? So there is no restrictions on US companies to sell to China below, say, 28 nanometers or 12 nanometers, whatever. So if your chips are less complex than what comes to below 12 nanometer chips, then they are free to sell. But if they are more complex, and then there are restrictions which are coming in with an eye to, can they be used in military, etc. Again, it's very difficult to assess, right? Some of those things can also be used for commercial processes, but still they are trying to be restrictive to a particular level. Beyond that, the trade between US and China on chips will go as it will go in other spheres, because it is again very difficult to decouple. Chinese players need US chips, and US needs Chinese customers, the companies. So the idea is to dissociate at very specific levels, and the State Department has kept moving the goalposts, trying to sharpen these export controls, etc. But yeah, it's very difficult, and I think because of the amount of money countries are putting in, probably you will have some even redundant capacity building in. And when this semiconductor industry, as it is prone to its ups and downs, there are cycles. Once you have a lot of manufacturing capacity built in and the demand doesn't go at the same level, all these fabs which are going to come up in the next 3-4 years, they are going to face some problems, right? And then they will again demand another round of subsidies from their governments to keep them sustaining. But yeah, I mean, we have entered that world actually. So
yeah, so with the US and China, I'm surprisingly I'm less concerned about that because as you mentioned, the policy, I think this government has called it a small yard with high fences or something like that, right? So the idea is that it's a very small list of goods which will absolutely be controlled, and on everything else we will keep things relatively open. And the reason why I think it's important is I am that housewife who wants a cheaper washing machine, and for better or for worse, my washing machine uses relatively sophisticated chips and semiconductors, and I would like my clothes clean and dry on time, right? Same thing with something as basic as my rice cooker or my coffee maker, right? I mean, these are literally things that save me time, and I deeply care about these things. Now, the attitude is not quite the same in other countries, either because they don't have such a large volume of trade with China, or they may already have other historical legacy problems with their trade policy, like India, right? In those countries, my fear is right now there are a lot more export controls that are being placed, and they are being placed to build resilience. Are we going to end up in a world where you neither have resilience nor do you have innovation, and the person who loses the most is not just your space program? Because, eventually they are willing to do things at a higher cost, military and space. They will figure out how to make their own, manufacturing or fabrication units. It's really going to be the housewife, right? Who can't sort of, set her rice cooker and walk away to play with her kids or walk away to go to work and has to kind of stand over the stove. So that's sort of what's happening in smaller countries. And that's what I'm just much more focused on, maybe because I'm not a geopolitical person. How do you think about how that's playing out?
Yeah, so I agree that costs will rise, and I think a recent article by Geeta Gopinath had tried to estimate some of the costs that are coming in because of these kinds of export controls and the sort of loose decoupling that we are having. And yeah, I mean, I think it put estimates to 5% of global GDP shrinkage because of if we take these things to the extreme. So that's a really significant one, and it is going to hurt obviously the developing countries more than the countries which can absorb some of these losses, right? So yeah, I mean, these are real costs which are going to happen. I think the side to blame or is also in the case that the fact that China also tried to do Make in China in 2025, that was the starting trigger for this whole idea about structural rivalry and the fact that are we too dependent on China for our own good? And once that conversation started in a lot of countries, including in India, it's very difficult to stop that, So even, I mean, we keep making the argument that trade is positive. It's okay if we are buying some low value chips from China. How does it matter? It's not as if they can engineer some specific thing which will be used for espionage against you. It's very difficult to do that. And even if they can, you can figure out technological solutions to that. But once national security becomes the predominant frame through which you start seeing these issues, then many of our arguments take a backseat, and we have entered that phase for good or bad, and that's why every nation state is getting into this game in one way or the other.
So, now that we're talking about every nation state is getting into this game, I want to go back to the earlier conversation where you talked about there are 3 parts to the process. One is design, the second is manufacturing, and the third is assembly. Now, when it comes to design started as a highly centralized thing in Silicon Valley, literally in 2 or 3 labs and companies. But actually, design counterintuitively has become the most decentralized aspect of it, right? Especially because of the economic innovations of separating the fab and foundry aspect from the design aspect. So, even a startup in an apartment in Kormangla can do its own design because it can license a whole bunch of software. It can actually write and license on others' patents and only make very, very specific design changes. And it seems like India is doing pretty well on this, or at least Indians are doing pretty well on this. There's a lot of design work that involves Indians. I think you estimate it as, 90% of the chips in the world have, at least Indians in 1 out of 5 processes or something like that, right? Like 20% Indians are involved in 90% of the chip design in the world. So that part seems straightforward. Now, the second part is manufacturing, right? Manufacturing, which one would normally think is, there are many countries that have manufacturing abilities. We know, even when it comes to textiles or shoes, we know China dominated for a long time. But there were lots of countries, Vietnam, Taiwan, Bangladesh now, which started entering that world. But that has not been the case for the semiconductor industry. That is just highly concentrated, especially in East Asia. And of course, Taiwan dominates that world. So can you walk me through what is it about chip manufacturing that it has this kind of bizarre geographical or economic sort of concentration, and why the rest of the world can't quite catch up? Because when TSMC creates, they just built out a new fab in Arizona at some astounding 12 or 15 billion or something like that. And it's still going to be about 40 to 50% more expensive than the same chip that's produced in Taiwan, which itself is crazy. And I recently read that apparently TSMC is not even considering Arizona as a serious venue because they're moving things to Japan because of all the DEI and environmental and labor restrictions that have been worked into the CHIPS Act. And, they're not able to hire the talent they want. And they flew in a few hundred Taiwanese to the fab, and apparently the local workers got quite mad about it. And now they're apparently moving everything to Japan. So one, is this all true, and why is all this happening?
Yeah. So the central part about the Taiwan thing is that given that China-Taiwan relations are worsening, even TSMC would want to diversify and have an option in other places. And of course, US, Japan want to have that option that TSMC comes to other places. Even Indian government was wooing TSMC from a long time. And when all these things happened, it was, why would TSMC pick a place like India when other countries are giving more incentives and have experience in making chips? So that was the starting point. But I don't think US and Japan are substitutes. It will happen in both. And the US taxpayers will pay for the money for the chips made in America, right? That is how it will go, because US is trying to woo TSMC, and US-Taiwan political relations are important there, right? So this is not just no longer an act between two commercial parties. The governments are involved, and US government would have insisted that TSMC do build some capacity in US as well, not even if it is doing so in Japan and other countries. So the facilities will get built. After that, whether the chips will be economical enough or not, or who buys a premium for that, that is really a problem. And I fear that you might have some local sourcing mandates going forward.
There are local sourcing mandates,
so
yes.
That's what the Atmanirbharta narrative will come there also. That's the only way you can sell a chip which is made by the same company and is 40% costlier, right? There's no other difference.
So I have a secondary concern there, if I can stop for a moment. So my problem is not just that it's 40% more expensive, right? So maybe there is reason to say that, hey, when it comes to certain tech, we'll just use it for stuff we use for NASA and the Pentagon and the US military. The Arizona fab will be used just for that. And for, the chip that's rolling down the windows in my car or whatever is going in in, I don't know, every single electronic good that all Americans are consuming, we can continue fabricating that in China, because even if there's a pandemic or a war, of course, there are going to be disruptions, but it won't be at the military level or something like that, right? Like US is not hobbled by it. So I can understand that, but that's not how it's being sold. It's being sold as a place that will also produce commercial chips. My question is, who's going to buy chips 40% more expensive? Because at the end of the day, we're standing outside Walmart on Thanksgiving Day trying to get the cheapest electronics at the best price. So that's the part which doesn't add up for me. So who's actually going to buy this? How do we actually subsidize every single washing machine? Like, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, the two things which you said are not necessarily substitutes, because even if you total all the military requirements of the US armed forces, it will really be insignificant compared to the commercial demand, which needs to be produced by that chip to sustain itself as a viable economic entity. So really, military, yeah, you can get some made in America chips for US military, but still for that fab to survive, you will need to do commercial manufacturing. And yes, the problem they'll hit is who are going to buy those chips. So the only way I foresee it might work is if you have local sourcing mandates, which is another big problem. So believe me, no government has thought through this. It is the narrative about national security is so strong that many of these questions aren't being asked enough. The idea is that, okay, we need to do things to reduce dependence from China. Even if we have to pay a cost, we'll pay it. And many of the companies are hoping that governments will bring in local sourcing mandates. So earlier industry bodies in the semiconductor domain were singing paeans about the globalization and how this is a poster child for everything that we learn in trade theory. But the same industry bodies are now also saying
protectionism.
We want to do things made at home. We'll make more secure chips. So that's really the part of it. And coming back to your question on why did things happen in East Asia, right? East Asia, again, it is diversified. Like, there were chips being made in US as well, and US has a significant manufacturing capacity, just that it happens at the lower end. Europe did have, but again, costs kept rising. Just imagine, right? Manufacturing and assembly are both labor intensive, and manufacturing is capital intensive. And I said it had environmental costs earlier. So all those led to geographies which had two advantages, where one, assembly costs were lower, so labor costs were lower. And second, they were very globalized and connected with the US ecosystem. So that is East Asia, right? So again, Taiwan, starting 1950s, 60s, trade liberalization happened. So a lot of US companies are very comfortable doing a transfer of technology to Taiwanese firms even back then, right? And then so is the case with Japan as well. So without FDI, they were able to get a lot of technology to these places, which was not the case with China. But for Taiwan, Japan, because of them being allies and in good relations with the US, that happened. So that diffusion.
And China also kind of drove its experts away, right? It was making its physicists turn into gardeners and, farmers in rural areas. And the Cultural Revolution really just killed engineering and physics expertise in a way that it just decimated any chance of a semiconductor industry showing up there.
Absolutely. No, I mean, the first IC in China was made before Taiwan got there. Again, it's a very typical case of how government-run programs of this kind fail. So, in fact, we've tried to draw comparisons between USSR, China, and India experience. The lessons are same in all of them. Taiwan, because of the global integration, the East Asian market really caught on to that. Other countries have tried, and to some limited success, like Israel, etc., have developed some expertise in manufacturing. But this confluence of factors, good relationships with the US, integrated with the global market, low import tariffs, so on and so forth, was there in East Asia and not in many other countries.
So, this is a good point to actually talk about what you just mentioned, which is what happened in China, what happened in the Soviet Union, what happened in India. And these are all sort of like high socialism, right? Varying levels of command and control, where actually India comes out looking good in this comparison. So, I want to start with the Soviet Union, which is the most extraordinary example because at some point they actually built a city from scratch, which was supposed to mimic Silicon Valley and sort of that environment of Bell Labs, Fairchilds, Texas Instruments, and the sort of innovation that took place. So let's start with what happened with the Soviet Union, then we'll, move on to India. So did this work? I mean, we know it didn't work, but why didn't it work?
Yeah. So, I mean, in classic USSR style, the idea was they'll have one city to make one kind of thing, right? So there was one city, Zelenograd, which was supposed to make chips, and it was supposed to be the chip capital of the USSR. But today, USSR has no commercial manufacturing facilities, much like India. So obviously that failed. Now, a lot of things they tried to do from a very different angle compared to the US. So again, in the US, the idea was it happened far away from Washington, DC. There, it happened in California, a lot of factors going into that. Whereas in the USSR, it was a government directed program, largely looking at what can we do for the military side, where can we go ahead. So they start, all these projects have a common feature because they are government run. They do have a quick beginning. The government is able to put in money, things start working. But as you go on to the next step, right now, capital costs will keep rising because of Rock's law. You need to be able to make a chip which will go to commercial players to recoup the costs that you're putting in on the capital. Now, why would a government firm do that? So, no
And they couldn't
incentive.
even get the amount of soap and, light bulbs and toothpaste they needed, right? Because of the calculation problem. So the idea that they will improve chips because it's going in microwaves and, washing machine is ludicrous, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So all those things didn't happen. And also the cutting edge of design also requires large number of engineers from across the world coming in and trying to do this kind of innovation and new ideas. That wasn't the case in USSR as well. So a lot of their initial projects were trying to replicate what the things that were happening in the US. So it largely became a copycat model with, and trying to build things. And then there were a lot of ideas about espionage, etc. So it went into a very different realm, which was not conducive to quick innovation and cycles of repeated new things.
And the worst thing is trade policy, right? Because you have to import so much globally, not just the raw materials and the materials with which you dope and rare minerals and so on, but also like simple things like, the nuts and bolts for a very expensive fabrication machine, which are only available in certain places. So if you have across the board crazy kinds of tariffs, but you only liberalize them for military use, suddenly none of it works. Like you need a very flat, open trade and tariff regime for even one chip to be built efficiently is what I've learned really from the Soviet Union example.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that is the same lesson for India and China as well. And in India's case, because of limited foreign exchange. So there was again the idea that foreign exchange is so precious that anything imported is big evil sin done. So the idea was you preserve that, and throughout 70s, 80s, even when companies were trying to do a few things, when they had to import manufacturing equipment, they couldn't. And by the time they got their licenses and they made that chip, that chips
Moore's law had kicked in.
Yeah, and you could just buy
You are
something.
15 years too old.
Yeah, so the government companies themselves bought chips from outside. Like, why would you buy a 50x costlier chip which comes 10 years later?
So I want to come to India. India is a slightly different case because it seems like, unlike China, which sort of literally killed sometimes its own engineering talent, India's engineering sort of science talent was pretty good. And from what I understand from your book, the early stages, even the tech transfers were workable, right? Philips actually did collaborate with India, right? As did the Americans. So sort of the same kinds of collaborations that Taiwan took advantage of, they were offered in some shape or form to India. So India had the right talent, but India also had all the other things that you mentioned. It had the cheap labor, that you need for a large assembly. It had spaces where you could think about, what do we do about environmental pollution or look the other way because happens to be much larger country than Taiwan. You can seclude pockets where such industrial activity takes place. But it never takes off in India, right? So can you tell me what are the reasons for that before, say, liberalization, the very autarky-related examples that you were talking about a minute ago? And then we can talk to what happened post-liberalization and why it still didn't take off.
Yeah, so initially, the difference between Taiwan and the Indian idea was a lot of the experiments from the Indian side were done by government companies for government products. So we call that first version by the government and for the government, right? So the idea was there will be two government companies which will make chips, and obviously that back then the demand was also largely in the government, so it was never thought of that you need private investment, and also maybe the capacity also wasn't there, but the idea was only government companies will do this. So BEL, Bharat Electronics Limited, started making transistors in the 1950s. Wasn't that bad, was doing reasonably well.
They were pretty good.
Yeah, and you said, there was technology transfer also coming in. Philips and Radio Corporation of America, RCA, which did tech transfer in India as well. And that was the same company which did tech transfers to Taiwan as well. So yeah, tech transfers did happen initially, but you again entered that cycle where, okay, companies were able to make these chips initially, but then you had this problem because these are government run firms. The government then started saying, hey, so two firms were doing Semiconductor
SCL.
Complex Limited, SCL Chandigarh, and BL. So then the government said, hey, why are two firms doing the same thing? Competition is not good.
Wastage.
Yeah, it is wastage. Why is this being done? So then they said, okay, SCL, you do chips, and BEL, you only do the integration. So you killed competition. Why will there no incentive for SCL to do anything new? So that was the first reason. The second reason was on the trade side that we talked about already. And the third reason was, of course, that capital costs kept increasing, and the government said, I can't pump in 2x the amount every 4 years. I'm not going to do that. And hence, these companies started actually falling behind the cutting edge slowly and really couldn't do much. So SCL still exists today. But it largely in 2004 or 5, it was taken
only
over
for ISRO, right?
by Department of
Basically.
Space, and it largely supplies to the space. And recently, last year, it has been moved to METI, so the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, and the aim is that they want to convert it into a private commercial fab probably down the line, but that is the phase. So again, these three figures, the same thing happened in China as well, pretty much the same things.
Plus the Cultural Revolution. They did one more terrible thing in addition to India.
Yeah. And
no, but
many people would have gone to Taiwan because of that as well.
And Hong Kong, right? There was an exodus to Hong Kong and Taiwan and so on. So, coming back to India, so the way I thought about it, when I was trying to read the parallels between what happened in the US and Taiwan and what happened in India, so it seems like, one, of course, like you said, the government, socialist command and control hates wastage because they don't understand quite the point of it. But there were two other things. One, because of the autarkic nature, India was not an export country, right? So if your domestic market is limited, like when Taiwan started on this journey, its domestic market wasn't rich, right? People were poor. They were in the countryside. They weren't actually demanding the microwaves and the washing machines that the chips were being made for. But they were a huge export economy, which means they were supplying to the rest of the world. And as their people got richer, they were also supplying to domestic firms. But in India, we were never export-led because we were autarkic. And because we were autarkic, we had foreign exchange control problems, so we couldn't import. But the second aspect of it was the license permit Raj, which also is, trade and tariffs, they are a tax on the foreign producer and the domestic consumer, right? That's how I think about it. Whereas license permit Raj is a tax on the domestic producer and the domestic consumer. So if you have license permit Raj and you won't give, Bajaj scooters or, your ambassador cars and so on, an expansion permit to serve the domestic market, and you kill all competition in the domestic market, then you also won't have innovation in the domestic market. So you're not going to have people. I mean, we could have had Indian made cars that needed advanced semiconductor chips to roll the window up and down, or, everyone in India cooks rice. You could have had an electric rice cooker so early in India. But the license permit Raj kills that side of it. So it's so many own goals, it's not just one thing that so my sense is the government led firm for the government and by the government is just the starting of the story. But even when you liberalize that, like even if they had sold and when they were willing to sell, SEL and BEL, there are no buyers for it because no one wants to deal with any of this even by the early 90s, right? So now with liberalization, we have some liberalization on the trade side. We sort of kill the license permit Raj. So a domestic market starts opening up. Why doesn't the semiconductor industry take off at that point in India? Because now it looks like this could happen.
Right. So the second phase, we call it the unease of doing business in India. And that was the phase between 2005 and 2005, there were a few attempts done. There were a few attempts done in 2013-14 and then in 2015. So all these we've classified together as a second set of attempts. And the idea again, there was one, we should start from some assembly and then we'll get to fabs. And a few projects were tried. But by that time, a couple of things happened. One, the idea was that the fab market itself was consolidating, right? Because of Rock's law, costs were increasing. So companies like AMD, etc., which were interested in trying to do things, they themselves became fabless. And they said, we can't run this foundry business, too costly for us, right? So the entire consolidation phase was happening. So globally, there were headwinds. Second, in India itself, there were things like retrospective taxation that we were doing in 2012, etc. So just imagine for a manufacturing facility to come up, even if you're going to put money today, the first chip that will come out is 5 years down the line. And maybe it will come into a product 6 years down the line. So
regime uncertainty is a killer.
Yeah. So how can you put billions of dollars of investment for something which is so uncertain, right? And that policy uncertainty was something which really hurt. That was the major reason in our assessment. And the third reason, of course, was that, the domestic demand was not that great. GDP per capita was not that high. And exports, India doesn't naturally think of exports, or like you were saying, right? So the idea still was that, can we serve the domestic market? Domestic market wasn't huge. So why should you do this in India and not Malaysia, which already is well integrated into the international market already? So that's why India sort of lost out on these factors, and none of the investors which showed interest went ahead with this. So all of these were at the MOU stage, memoranda of understanding, never made it to anything more significant than that. And all the multiple projects just died down because largely of the policy uncertainty, tax uncertainty, high tax environment, and the trade policy, because we still did have import tariffs, which made it difficult for companies to do business here. So
this is, an odd thing, right? We get this insight later from Krugman, but our idea is in our heads, when we study textbook economics, that if you're producing semiconductor chips, it's the law of comparative advantage, right? Like how Ricardo wrote about, port and corn. Like, you are producing one thing and you're deeply specializing in one thing, you'll sell that one thing and you'll buy everything else. But what we now realize is that Taiwan is both the biggest exporter of semiconductor chips, but also the biggest importer of semiconductor chips. And this tends to happen because of diversification. Like I said, this was the big insight from Krugman, that the kinds of things we end up importing largely mirror the kinds of things we are exporting because of specialization and diversification which happens across the board in the same economy. So the big problem with this kind of government involvement, especially in modern day post-liberalization India, is it comes with protectionism, right? That's the guarantee. We will protect you from foreign competition in chips, and the chip manufacturers and everyone else who's associated with them, like say Apple or, any big electronics, they're like, no, you don't understand. We need lots of different kinds of chips. So you can't say we will be a chip exporter and also have an electronics industry that's thriving or a car industry that's thriving because they're going to import chips. So this, I think, is like such a fundamental Econ 101 insight that no one in government seems to have understood or cracked. It's just like at home, the homes of people which have fantastic cooks, they're also people who are foodies. So they end up getting a lot of great food diversified from all over the place, but they also end up cooking up a storm at home and, having like lots of different kinds of cuisines, right? So if you are a foodie, that's how you think about the world. If you're a foodie equivalent, if you're a chippy, you specialize in semiconductor chips, you want to buy lots of chips, you're also going to sell lots of chips. So this doesn't seem to get processed. Like, why is this insight so difficult to crack?
Yeah, you have to tell me that. I am myself completely flummoxed by this. But just one minor thing, Taiwan is not the biggest importer of chips, but their biggest import is also chips, just like their biggest export.
Exactly.
Chips.
Sorry, yes. Yeah. That's a very good correction. Yeah. Their biggest imports and their biggest exports are chips.
Oh, yeah. So that's one. But I think in the Indian side, with the trade, we have this relationship, right? Like we always want to do both industrial policy and tariffs and trade restrictions simultaneously, right? And that's what we are doing even in this current phase. And the whole idea is we'll have them phased regime of where we'll keep increasing the import tariffs on different components such that over time, all of these things will happen in India. So that's what we did in electronics as well. But I do see that now, because a lot of the people who are investing are the MNCs which do rely on a lot of these transfers, they have been pushing for the governments to change this idea. So in fact, the ministry itself released a report a year ago which said that, we should first globalize and then try to localize instead of trying to do both simultaneously, which has been our approach since last 30-40 years, right? That both we need to do simultaneously. So we will globalize by giving some money to companies to invest here, and we localize by just putting tariffs and some sort of restrictions.
Has this report managed to cross the street and enter the Commerce Ministry at all? Because the news doesn't seem to have reached them.
No, I mean, at least last month or so, for example, the tariffs rates were reduced. So maybe
after a big U-turn before that.
So but it's tough. And we also did things like the laptop quote unquote monitoring regime.
The ban.
So, and then they went back on that, right? So
that's the regime uncertainty part. It's cuckoo, right?
So absolutely, like the fact that what we say about trade and this industry itself has operated in a way that you need to import a lot of things to export is something which is really central to it, and it has escaped the government thinking. But now I guess that point has been made by enough players and the government is changing policy. At least I can see tangible changes in terms of reducing tariffs, acknowledgement that we can't become, independent of Chinese chips all of a sudden. In fact, 64% of the chips consumed in India come from China, Hong Kong, Macau combined. So there is a realization now that you need some of this to happen and you don't want to shut it down all of a sudden. We might see the repeat of this 2-3 years down the line. I don't have that confidence myself.
It's one of those, it just keeps coming back. And, when I wear my economics educator hat, I'm like, okay, all of us should just die in shame because we have not managed to communicate this basic insight. But on the other hand, I'm like, it seems like enough people have talked about it since the late 80s. Enough government reports seem to have these ideas. But there's something about this command and control nature of bureaucrats and how they like to do things by diktat and notification, right? So I think all the three issues that you mentioned are in some sense integrated. The government likes pet projects because that's what politicians like. But bureaucrats like to be able to sign off on things and undo the signing off on things, when there are protests or when circumstances change. And that general idea that you need rule of law, you shouldn't have highly centralized control, right? You should not have lots of exceptions when it comes to your tariff or tax policy. Like GST should be 1 or 2 rates. It should not be 8 rates, right? So this is just somehow, I think, this is the Indian DNA, which is why I constantly, anytime I become slightly hopeful when I read like good news, I'm like, okay, no, this good news came because we have a chip engineer who is also the minister at the moment. And the moment that goes away, it's going to be ruled by the typical command and control bureaucrats, and then everything will go to hell. So that's sort of my reason for pessimism. You're laughing.
I know. I mean, that scares me, but yeah, I mean, hopefully the point has been made by enough people and the companies, and some of these are irreversible in a sense once the companies have invested. For example,
enough skin
Apple,
in the game,
yeah, they have already thought that many of the Apple suppliers are Chinese, so you need to get them in. So there have been exemptions made for these companies. So I think that idea is dawning upon a lot more people now.
So, one of the biggest success story examples of industrial targeting is TSMC. Right? So the idea is actually it went up to the president level, right? A red carpet was rolled out for Morris Chang. Literally phone calls were made the government put in money and gave a bunch of subsidies, but phone calls were made by the Taiwanese government to a number of industrialists saying, hey, you got a lot of help from us in, many years ago. It's time to pay back and you all have to put in money into TSMC. And, so on and so forth. So it's always, when we say, hey, industrial targeting, industrial planning doesn't work, TSMC is the poster child that it does. So first question is it the poster child for industrial planning or were there other factors? And second, what is the appropriate role of government which led to success in the case of TSMC, and is it at all replicable?
Tough question if we can replicate it, but it's always multi-causal. And even in this case, the fact that you had someone like a Morris Chang who didn't rise to the top level of Texas Instruments and then wanted to come back here. Also, the fact that US-Taiwan relations were great, technology transfers could happen. The fact that Taiwan could export to the richer world back then, and the fact that Taiwan didn't do a command and control approach, right? So there were financing done, but there were multiple companies which were doing manufacturing. So there is TSMC, but Taiwan also has PSMC, there is UMC, and there were many others as well. So the approach was not necessarily that manufacturing has to be done by government, but the finance part did come from government. A lot of backing was given, but if you think of finance, produce, regulate as the three functions of the government, they were not into the production side of it, right? They were into the finance side or the regulation side. So,
and even on the finance side, there were enough other private players who had to put in money and who would lose their investment if TSMC didn't work.
Yeah. And some of them were foreign investors as well, right? So all those things were well designed by Taiwan. And many countries tried to do industrial targeting, and even Taiwan would have tried for many companies, but the confluence of factors for TSMC sort of worked a lot better than the other countries. And China also tried. So there's Richard Chang who comes back again from the US. But by that time, obviously China doesn't get transfer of technology from the US. So it is a lot through FDI and a lot of engineers from Taiwan going to China as well. And that's how they build their industry in their second phase, and a lot of funding for this again comes from foreign investors plus the government. So all of these have to fall in place. It's not just one of them.
To me, the differentiating aspect is that despite every sort of red carpet rolled out by the government, at the end of the day, the East Asian countries demand that their producers meet the global market test, right? Whereas the Soviet, Indian, and erstwhile Chinese, of course, not the new modern day Chinese, but they not only had industrial planning or targeting, they also protected the same firms that were, sort of given the special treatment were also protected from the global test. So in a sense, the bad companies never perished, and we never knew which are the good companies that actually benefited from, government subsidies or certain kind of schemes or certain credit benefits and tax exemptions and so on. So to me, that seems to be the incredible thing about South Korea and Taiwan, that we'll give you everything, but if you don't meet the global market test when it comes to price, innovation, efficiency, and you fail that test, it's over for you, right? Not only will these benefits be taken away, you will be completely out of the loop, and the government will not give you any, especially in the case of South Korea. Like, they were pretty brutal with failed entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, letting losers go is equally important, right? But I somehow think, and this is not a well-founded idea, but I think, is there like a curse of a big-sized economy, right? So once you have a bigger economy, then you have industries and domestic players who settle to this low-level equilibrium of saying that I can just try to service the domestic market. Why should I even think of being the world's best? Whereas for South Korea and the smaller countries, that was never an option, right? Like, you have to target the wider world to be able to do something significant. But maybe with India and China, there is this idea that, just serve the domestic market, it's big enough. And also knowing fully that you can stop the external foreign players from coming in through some protectionist measures. So just put some restrictions and then serve the domestic market and be happy with it. Many times we fall into that low level equilibrium is what I feel.
Yes and no. I'll tell you what I mean by yes. I agree with your observation that big economies do suffer from this kind of thinking. What I mean by no is they can't get away with it. It's not like India got rich despite behaving like this. The fact of the matter is, India did not get rich, right? India was richer than South Korea in 1955, when South Korea was like the second or third poorest country in the world. It was where Syria and Yemen are today. It was devastated by civil war. It had no natural resources. In the early 60s and late 60s, it was exporting human hair as a large chunk of its exports, right? That's how bad it was. When India was making semiconductors, that's what South Korea was doing. But South Korea got rich. So India, by doing this, did not get rich. And there are a lot of small economies across Africa, across Latin America, which are poor because they didn't do what South Korea and Malaysia and Taiwan did, right? So I don't think the difference is just one of big versus small economies. I think large economies have more arrogance. So that's, I think, the right observation. But I don't think large economies can get away with it at all. I mean, China could not get away with it until it turned into an export-oriented economy and passed the global market test, which India, frankly, has still not passed when it comes to manufacturing. It's only passed it when it comes to services in some reasonable level.
Yeah, I agree that the countries can't get over it, but some conglomerates in that country can.
Yes, exactly. So you can have large car manufacturers, for instance, in India, which never innovate, which, will have like 200%, 180% tariffs, which will say, okay, we'll put in an FDI plant somewhere in Tamil Nadu and we'll just continue to manufacture the same old car over and over again. When I come to India, I see people, I'm thrilled that people are excited about getting new cars, but those cars are like 30-year-old models in the United States, and at a higher price actually in India than what they would sell for a dollar value, not even purchasing power value. So those things, they're getting away with it, but in a world of Instagram and YouTube where everyone can see what's out there, how long they can keep this going, this arrogance going, is also, little bit unclear to me. The last question I had on sort of, this Taiwanese sort of domination is, How important are individuals in this story? Because in your book, when you're writing about the geopolitics, the geoeconomics, you also weave in all the interesting characters, right? The people who made the early innovations, the people who won the Nobel Prize, right? The people who then started these companies, who are, sort of, the way Morris Chang actually comes out of retirement when he thinks TSMC is going the wrong way and not investing enough after the global financial crisis. So there seem to be some very important people in the mix. So how important do you think is the actual individual at the helm of these things?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say that leadership, initial conditions matter for institutions, and one of the initial conditions that matters is leadership. So many of the people who were in the right place at the right time with the right skills do matter. But even at a meta level, individuals, as in not a specific person, but the role of people is, and talent is very important in this industry, right? So just the fact that TSMC's magic is, I mean, not so much in the machines that they are using, but they have perfected a recipe and they have the processes that have allowed them to do the same thing, which technically other companies can also do, but they are able to do that higher yields with lower wastage, greater efficiency, right? So that is, so the advantage of TSMC and their strategic advantage is in the fact that their engineers are able to do that and their leadership is able to do that. It is able to work with a Netherlands firm. It has been able to work with a Japanese firm and make this perfect recipe. So that's why I often think of, even if China were to take over Taiwan for some other reason, but TSMC will still not be workable. In fact, the TSMC CEO has been on record saying this because they think their strategic advantages in terms of what their people bring to the table and working with the world,
Absolutely.
which will be difficult for many other countries or companies to replicate.
I was having an interesting conversation. Actually, I don't want to say his name in case there are issues. He's one of the long-time listeners of my podcast and works at ASML. And I was asking him about, this idea of the government trying to get a semiconductor industry going from scratch and so on. And this, I mean, ASML is one of the most specialized firms in the world. He also reinforced the fact that nowadays when we think of tech transfers, it's not just about patents and so on. It's actually about the people. You need the ASML, the process that they have to run, let's say over 24 or 48 hours, you need 2 or 3 very specific engineers to be available in the room during that time, without which that process can't be conducted. So that is the transfer which is so difficult when it comes to tech transfer, as opposed to just handing over blueprints or, having a licensing arrangement that's friendly in terms of patents or designs or something like that. So I think what sort of makes me sad is there are a lot of Indian engineers, Indian born, Indian trained engineers who actually end up going to Eindhoven and working at places like ASML. So we do manage to produce the human capital. And India is one of those bizarre countries, right? We're in 2-3 centuries at the same time. So we also have the ASML engineer capability in large enough numbers. And we also have enough people who are leaving farming and part of the structural transformation of coming to get an assembly line job, in the city or in a factory and so on. So we could actually be part of the entire process, start to finish, not in the same state. You'll probably have the ASML and the design people in Bangalore. You'll probably have an industry somewhere in interior Karnataka or, interior Andhra Pradesh. And then you'll have an assembly line somewhere in MP or UP if they ever get their act together. So, we could do this. So what saddens me about this is India is large enough. It has the talent at every level. It has the cheap labor supply. It has the high. It has every part of the mix, and it's just terrible policies, regime uncertainty, and poor infrastructure, which have stalled the entire thing.
That was the trouble, but now recent policies, because of that, we have some initial wins, but again the cost numbers, etc., we have to see whether they are able to again make chips economically which others will buy, right? That all remains. But now on the assembly side, there are 3 or 4 projects which are starting up, including Micron. There's one fab which has been announced just a couple of weeks ago, which is coming up in Gujarat. And there are now the focus of the government is shifting to design. And I think that should have been our primary focus. But nevertheless, if we've also get our act together on that, that's the quickest way, because as you said, the talent does exist in many places, but there are difficulties for a firm to prototype, to get things out quickly. The gestation periods are much longer compared to in software. Also, we don't have the VC ecosystem like we have in software for this hardware. So in my mental model is hardware, Indian hardware design firms are 10 years behind where Indian software firms were. So we'll get hardware products as well. It will take some time, but for that phase to happen, a lot more things need to happen on the design side. So hopefully if that happens, we will have some ecosystem. Again, manufacturing, you have to run the 40-year race, right? It's a marathon which TSM
and you have to liberalize everything. That's the thing about manufacturing. You can't have special exceptions, right? I mean, it may work for one odd thing, but for a manufacturing world to sustain itself, only if it's broad-based across the board will you get better infrastructure, will you get better transportation, will you get better usage of ports. I mean, everything is interconnected, right? It's not just about creating a special SEZ within a special corridor where you put a special plant that is treated specially by the special government.
Yeah, I mean, even labor reforms, right? For example, the Taiwanese firms are used to 2 shifts of 12 hours each.
Yes.
Now when they wanted to start assembly for plants, one of their demands has been that we want to do the same thing because we are used to doing this. Now you have to do 3 shifts. It's a big cost for them. And none of our states, as you know, has done the 12-hour shift when Tamil Nadu.
And this is not just semiconductors, right? It's the same problem with Apple. Everyone is used to the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the South Korean model of working, which is the 12-hour shift. So if there were 3 or 4 things that you could say absolutely need to be done before we can even think of emerging as a sort of, emerging player in the semiconductor industry, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, it would be different across the different segments. But I mean, at a meta level, we already discussed, we need to get
Let's start with assembly, because I think that's where there are actually some green shoots in India right now.
Yeah. So assembly, as I said, first, the trade policy. So import tariffs generally need to go down, especially you will need to import wafers to finally make them into packaged ICs. So import tariffs need to go down there. Tax policies as well. So even with GST, there has been an improvement, but further reductions will generally help across the board, not just for semiconductor industry. And the third one, as I said, labor law reforms are also important. Better infrastructure is also a part of that. These industries also require water, electricity. So, for example, electricity is not under GST. So, the cost disabilities add up, and they say.
And our discoms are in terrible shape, and our manufacturing, I mean, there's no stability. Each manufacturing unit actually has to generate its own power to even be functional.
Right. So, the captive power plants, etc. So, those electricity bringing under GST would be one way out. So these are the kinds of things which will help not just the semiconductor industry, but
it'll help everything.
Many others. So that is one. On the manufacturing side, this is one segment where every country in the world, the government has put in money, right? So even though we would like that this become a completely private run enterprise, but manufacturing semiconductors with the kind of capital cost required, governments have financed across. So the finance part is not a problem in India now. The government has backed at a considerable cost. But the idea is, will the industry be able to make chips economically? Now that requires again, to be able to run the business efficiently. So again, infrastructure matters, the electricity costs matter, the water
regime uncertainty, no demonetization, no Vodafone, no crazy, no laptop bans, I mean, like, we really need to work on very certain and stable economic rules environment.
Yeah, so that's one hope. I'm seeing it this way because the government is so invested in it, and the fact that now there is a big project coming in, I think it might prevent it from doing some of the things that you mentioned, because there is now skin in the game. The project is happening in much like what Montek Singh Ahluwalia wrote in the Maruti thing, right? Because it was a personal project of the government. A lot of things, the pathway for it was cleared compared to for other industries. So here also Dholera is a big project for the PM, the current PM. So he wants to see this happening. So maybe a lot
But
of...
you know, it's exactly the same reason I'm pessimistic, because what happens is with all the government backing, you feel like, oh, you have the government so invested, so now you can start asking for protectionism when you actually don't do well economically. And then there is a tendency of, oh, this is our project, it can't fail, because losing in the market test or failing the market test is a big, sort of egg on face for the government. So you start putting in protectionism and you say, no, now only domestic chips can be bought. Now all the cars produced in India will only buy the chips produced in Dholera. And that's how that goes. So I think I see both reasons. I see reasons for optimism, but I'm also quite nervous about the Maruti story playing out again.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that we'll come to know 5 years later when the chips come out. But absolutely a very possible thing which can happen. Yeah. And finally, in design, I think the idea
have an
is
edge.
you have a lot of people who can do the products. But the idea is now the government is again, the costs come in terms of the EDA tool, the software license costs, where the government is trying to help out. But the idea again, there are very strict restrictions on ownership of the intellectual property, on whether the company is quote unquote Indian or not. Again, our argument has been, don't bother about it as long as the firms are doing work in India. Just if you have to make things easier for them, just do that irrespective of whether the ownership is fully Indian or not, because it's quite natural that these companies will have investors in the US or other places, because the VC ecosystem doesn't exist in India as of now.
And that's part of the tech transfer. That's part of the knowledge transfer, right? Other companies in other countries putting in the money brings with it that kind of expertise and skin in the game. There, I think the biggest reform will be judicial. We need better enforcement of contracts, quick enforcement of licensing arrangements, actually upholding patents and not doing the sketchy things China did. I mean, these are sort of the things we need to focus on. So again, I think the big thing I took away from the book is all the reforms one needs to do to become a leader in semiconductors and protect national interest and build resilience, you need to do for all broad-based manufacturing and export-led economy anyway. So that's really the way to go.
Absolutely. Yeah. We tend to get focused on the specifics of that industry, but the more you see that, the more these lessons become clearer, that it's not something, one policy or one great idea which can change things, but you need to do things which help pro-market reforms, which help every industry.
So this was really amazing, and I was hoping to also talk about We the Citizens, but now I have the perfect excuse to have you come back, maybe with your co-authors, Khyati. I haven't had a chance to speak with her yet, and so we can all have a conversation. Anupam also, I don't think we've had him yet on the podcast, so it would be lovely for you to come back with your other co-authors, and then we can talk about that book. But thank you so much for doing this. This was a pleasure.
Thanks, Shruti. Thanks for having me.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.